In this fourth installment in this series, I will explain how the concept of interference can be used as the justification for the importance of the broad protection of a guarantee of free speech. First, I must review how the concepts of the previous installments can be cohesively integrated before making the logical segue into the topic of free speech. Links to the previous 3 installments can be found in this video's description. This line represents the level of interference introduced at a given point of time. We remember this from the first installment. Here we can integrate that line into the graph of the price of a good over time from the same. Integrating what we learned in the second installment, the level of interference is equal to the cost of overcoming said interference, and can be represented by the change in slope of the line representing the change in price of a good or service over time. The resultant actual price change is a manifestation thereof, and the red highlighted area is the total cost over time of the introduction of interference. It should be noted that, as the interference only affects the slope of the line, if the element of interference is removed, this highlighted area will still continue to persist until further interference can be removed to allow for innovation to persist at such a level as to reduce the slope of the upper line to such a level that it might proverbially catch up to the lower line at some distant intersect point. Hopefully this clarifies how interference with mutually consensual transactions acts to increase the price of goods and services, and labor as well, as we might recall from the third installment, long-term, and, further, is long-term always to the significant detriment of the prosperity of a given society. In all 3 installments, I have identified several sources of interference, including several non-governmental sources, such as criminality and hooliganism. Economist Thomas Sowell expands upon the effects of hooliganism in his Compassion versus Guilt and Other essays, which I highly recommend as further reading on the matter, and I will post a link to an excerpt from said collection that pertains to this topic in particular in the description of this video. The questions that might get asked about all of this are: how does interference manifest with the exchange of ideas? What is the role of interference in the exchange of ideas? And how does mutual consent manifest in the same? There is a paradox inherent to obtaining mutual consent in an exchange of ideas. How does one know that the other party has consented or will consent to an exchange of ideas without first having an exchange of ideas to communicate said consent? In this manner, there are only 2 ways to bring an end to the paradox. One would be to terminate all communication, as asking someone for consent to communicate is itself a communication, and, as such, if all communication comes to a halt, we can be sure that any totally incidental and inanimate exchange that might by pure chance manifest would be consensual. The other would be to establish that all speech, so long as that speech itself does not inherently manifest as an interference with another source of mutual consent, i.e., the explicit and direct incitement of violence, is axiomatically consensual. From a governmental perspective, again, any amount of interference with the free exchange of ideas, since it will carry with it at least the threat of real violence, is inherently going to increase at net the amount of pre-existing interference, especially in the latter model, given the one exception, which of course is the threat of real violence. While the second model will invariably include exposure to ideas you do not like, this is flatly the cost of communication, that is, the risk of exposing oneself to ideas they may not like. It should become obvious then that the second model maximizes mutually consensual transactions. In this manner, we can easily see that the concept of interference can be used as the justification for the importance of the broad protection of a guarantee of free speech. There is a discussion to be had as to what constitutes the incision of violence that extends beyond the scope of this discussion. However, without a guarantee of the freedom for the individual to communicate, there can be no justification for communication between human beings, and this would manifest in the absolute abolishment of communicative exchange, which is how we, as human beings, develop our thought processes at a fundamental level. This is why the protection of a freedom of the exchange of ideas is the most important of all governmental guarantees, as, without it, we are hardly then even human beings. The founding fathers of these United States recognized this paradox, and it is fundamental to their decision to include in their Bill of Rights an explicit restriction on the introduction of governmental interference with the exchange of ideas. And it is why they guaranteed that protection in the very First Amendment to our Constitution. In this respect, in economic terms, a properly run society should recognize at a level that includes but well exceeds governmental authority that the proverbial freedom of speech is not just a guarantee of the government from interference with speech, but a statement about the core values espoused by the Founding Fathers to permeate throughout our society. In layman's terms, our society has established a system of values that insists that no member of our society stymie the exchange of ideas. It creates a should where there is also a must, all without governmental interference. This concludes the extent to which I had planned on defining and discussing the role of interference as a broad economic term. I am happy to answer any questions asked of me, and would be glad to produce further installments in the series upon request. So if you've liked this presentation, stay tuned, subscribe, and I will be happy to produce more content on this matter upon request. As always, I welcome your input in the comment section, and encourage viewers who enjoyed to click the like button. Until the next time, this is Mike from the Captain Phoenix channel signing off.